All right. Hello. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. Thank you all for joining us. I'm very excited to be here with you. But more so, I'm excited to be joined by three very special guests, uh, eminent scholars in their own right, CSA members, and just all around good people. So it's going to be a great conversation, and we're excited to see you here. So I am thrilled to be joined this evening in conversation with just three of many contributors to CSA's Dress special issue journal, which was titled Reframing Fashion in the Museum. This is volume 50, number 2, and I have to say, it was an absolute honor to be asked to work on this special issue as a guest editor. This was an idea that sort of sprung from conversations that I had with Ingrid Mita, who was the previous editor for Dress. And we were at CSA in Utah, and you never really know what's going to happen at a CSA conference, but usually very good ideas are born. And then I had the opportunity to continue my work with Dr. Inev Rabinovich-Fox, who is an amazing editor and really was a stalwart companion in this process. We worked on this special issue for over a year. We comprised and sent out the call for papers. We received a really fantastic response, and it was a pleasure to work with all of the authors included. And for this evening, I'm excited to just share an opportunity to dig deeper with just three of those many scholars. But just as a reminder for anyone who doesn't know Dress, it is the journal for the Costume Society of America. And it has been in publication since 1975. And really, it represents the highest level of scholarship and aims to address many of the diverse areas of study, including examinations of dress and art, social history, anthropology, and material culture. The journal invites work on fundamental concerns such as theory, research methods, and analytical and interpretive papers that describe and place dress in cultural or historical contents. And so I just wanted to share that a little bit for those of you who may be joining who may be unfamiliar. So let's dig in. Dyese Matthews, Sarah Scaturro, and Kenna Libes are our guests this evening. And Dyese is the Assistant Professor of Fashion, Management and Social Justice at Parsons School of Design. She aims to explore embodied experiences of the dressed body, intersections of dress practices and identity negotiations. She also looks at Black history and empowerment within the fashion system and consumer behavior practices related to textiles and apparel. Sarah Scaturro is the Eric and Jane Nord Chief Conservator at the Cleveland Museum of Art. She is also a PhD candidate in design history and material culture studies at Bard Graduate Center. Previously, she was the head of the Fashion Conservation Laboratory at the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So over the years, many of the wonderful fashion exhibitions that you've seen at the Costume Institute at the Met have been lovingly prepared and cared for by Sarah. She's also a textile conservator and assistant curator of fashion at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. And our last presenter this evening is Kenna Libes, who is a historian of dress, who currently researches size bias within museum collections. Her other interests have included 19th century African American wedding dress, beetle wing embroidery, and biomimicry within Indian and Anglo-European dress in the long 19th century, as well as terminology on historic underwear, including jumps and straight front corsets. She's published in journals such as our own, Dress, and for the Fashion History Timeline. And so it's a pleasure to have you all here. What we're going to do is ask each one of our presenters to deliver a brief overview of their particular essay for the journal, and then we're going to dive into conversation. So Dyese, why don't we start with you?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're very excited to share our work with you this evening and or morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. So I had the pleasure of writing with my co-authors listed here, Kat, Janine, and Ami. Um, the article titled Curating Community, Centering Collaboration, Public Engagement, Social Justice, and Empowerment Within the Fashion Museum. And this article, or the research report specifically, really was a culmination of an exhibition that we had the pleasure of curating at Cornell University as peers and PhD students in various programs. Um, so within our work, we really focused on thinking about the intersections of fashion museums and social justice specifically. We also had an emphasis on community engagement with our work. And we really wanted to think about what the Fashion Museum may look like as a space for critical dialogue, to have conversations in relation to community concerns, specifically topics related to social justice. So I want to just take a moment to really thank and shout out my co-curators and co-authors of this article, Kat, Janine, and Ami. On the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more about the exhibition itself. So the exhibition was titled Material Resistance, Social Justice and Empowerment Narratives Told Through Cloth. Again, it was part of a project at Cornell University, specifically a part of their biennial for 2022. So what we did was we collaborated with 5 artists and 3 community organizations, all of whom are listed here. And we curated an exhibition focused on textiles and clothing, and a little bit about how we came about collaborating with these specific folks. We really connected with people who are practiced in textile arts or design that speaks to a variety of different social justice issues, ranging from Indigenous rights, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, et cetera, et cetera. So we knew that we wanted to, again, work with artists and organizations that really stand by these types of conversations. And again, thinking about ways that we can really put emphasis on clothing, textiles, and fashion, and particularly within the museum space, right? And transforming the museum space into, again, a safe space and a space for critical dialogue on these topics. Again, we had a lot of emphasis on community collaboration. So ways that the way that we approached this project was, we're curating this exhibition. We know we want to focus on fashion, textiles, and social justice, but we really wanted to bring the community to be central to the conversation, kind of removing ourselves as curators in terms of being the dominant voice, but really just leaning into the Cornell community, the communities that are artists and organizations that we collaborated with, communities that they engage with on a daily basis. And we wanted to, again, transform the Fashion Museum into a space where we can have these types of critical dialogues and conversations. So listed here are some of the ways that we really leaned into the community collaboration aspect of our work, starting with the Social Justice Sewing Academy, which was on the previous slide as an organization that we worked with. We partnered with them and the Johnson Museum of Art at Cornell to engage in a quilt block making workshop. So SJSA is a nonprofit organization based out of the Bay Area, and they create a lot of different textile art materials, some of which are what they call community quilts. And these quilts are made of quilt blocks that are made across the US and beyond. And they're made in settings like this, where community members are coming together. They're having conversation about social justice issues that they're passionate about. And then they're using art to really make like a textile representation of those topics. And at the workshop, they're cutting fabric, they're gluing it down, and they're writing an artist statement. And then SJSA does the work of collecting those glued quilt blocks and then sending them out for embroidery, working with their embroidery volunteers. and then the blocks come back and it's turned into a quilt. So we really wanted to, again, put emphasis on the act of making, specifically with fashion and textile, and again, centering social justice within those conversations. The quilt actually just recently got finished, so hopefully we'll be in conversation soon about bringing the quilt back to Cornell. We also did an artist talk with the Cornell Indigenous Graduate Student Association, IGSA. Specifically, we brought Agnes Yellowbear, who is an Indigenous artist, to campus to have conversation with the campus community. We had a great turnout, and again, creating space for these types of conversations. My co-curators and I also did a number of curator-led tours of the exhibition for classes. We also found it really important to expand our reach beyond the Cornell community. So we were happy to host our opening reception on Instagram Live. And it was great because a lot of the folks that we worked with in Ghana were able to join us virtually that way. And then finally, we created a Microsoft Sway digital version of the exhibition booklet, again, thinking about ways that we can engage community outside of the actual exhibition space. So it's a link that's available that I'm happy to share at a later time. And then within that exhibition booklet that's on Microsoft Sway, there's a Matterport technology link where there's like a 3D walkthrough of the exhibition as well. So in short, our goal was to work toward and continue the work that's already being done in terms of transforming the Fashion Museum into a space where social justice can be talked about and prioritized, and then also can be recognized as an action item for our community members. So here's a QR code that you can scan to take you to that Matterport link that I mentioned. So if you get a moment after today's talk, please scroll through the exhibition booklet, and I'll be happy to receive any feedback.
Thank you, Dyese. And Sarah, would you please join us?
Hello. So thanks so much for having me. And I'd really like to thank you, Petra and ANAV and the CSA for the opportunity to publish my article, which was called For the People, Renewing Conservation Ethics for Dress Collections. So my article, stems from the 2022 incident in which Kim Kardashian wore Marilyn Monroe's gown to the Met Gala. And at the time, I was following and even participating in the discourse. And I was really heartened by the interest of the public, the interest that they had in the topic of when it was appropriate to wear historic fashion, and especially their reactions. Another participant in the discourse was ICOM Costume. For those of you who don't know, they're an international organization composed of museum professionals from around the world interested in the curation, conservation, and collections management of fashion and textiles. And they issued this statement that you see here on the screen. And I was really intrigued by their statement. And I have to admit, as a conservator, I was a bit let down because the statement reiterated a stance which by now is nearly 40 years old, stating that in no circumstances should historic costume held in a collection be worn. And they often, the statement was really predicated on the act of conserving and preserving the gown in question. And as a conservator, I immediately recognized that the statement didn't really reflect where conservation professionals themselves stood today. Conservators, for decades now have been reflecting on the parameters surrounding the wearing of historic costume. And we've come to recognize that in some instances, it's actually the most ethical thing to do is to actually have that piece of historic costume be worn. And this shift has a name in conservation. It's called peoples-based conservation. And so I just want to pause here to mention my own personal approach to fashion history and museology. I have tried to demonstrate and cultivate throughout my career the idea that conservation belongs within the curatorial realm and curatorial thinking belongs in conservation realm. I've really tried to facilitate and foster cross-disciplinary communication between these two professions. And so it was with this incident and with ICOM's statement that I decided, when I saw this call for papers, that it was probably a good time for me to write an article for scholars and curators describing the shift in fashion conservation ethics towards peoples-based conservation. So I started my article with a brief history of how and why historic costume has been worn. And this photo does not appear in the article, but I really love it. And so from the beginning, fashion curators have always understood that there is this desire and need to understand clothing best when it is worn. And so early curators like Anne Buck and Polaire Weissman, who are active from the 1940s into the 1970s, they positioned actually wearing historic costume as a form of research and promotion for their collections. And they thought it could actually be beneficial for costume to selectively be worn, especially for photographs, if it was done under the care of the curators themselves. And it's important to remember that by this time, there weren't actually costume conservators or fashion conservators around. They don't really appear until the 70s and 80s. And so it's also important to know that the dominant theoretical and ethical paradigm at this time in operation for fashion museology was really predicated on the basis that historic textiles were like documents. And these documents contained evidence that needed to be retained so that this evidence could someday be retrieved. And the way to retain the evidence is through conservation. So this led to this goal where we needed to, as conservators and as curators, to ensure that the objects stayed as they always were, that no historic evidence was ever lost. So in the 1970s, these curators actually also started noticing that there was widespread damage happening from historic garments being worn. Although, as you see in this wonderful image from the Costume Institute, costumes were still being worn in the 1970s. And in fact, this photo is taken here in the Costume Institute storage, which I find particularly interesting. At the same time in the 70s, the field is gaining a lot of confidence, and museum practitioners themselves were considering themselves as professionals. So as professionals, they had outlined clear expectations of what was expected of a professional, the kind of conduct that they were supposed to adhere to. And we also started having professional organizations like the CSA itself and ICOM Costume. And at the same time, there were also increasing academic graduate programs like the MA program at the Courtauld Institute, and the first one in the United States, which was at New York University. So by the 1980s, we have both ICOM Costume and the CSA in a place where they felt they had the authority and the desire to put a stop to what they saw as an evidence-destroying practice. And so ICOM Costume issued guidelines in the mid-80s, which were ultimately published in 1991. And then the CSA actually voted on a resolution in the mid-1980s prohibiting the wearing of historic costume. And it is true, wearing of historic costume does damage it in material ways. However, we have by the 1980s another shift that is already starting to begin with conservation ethics. It's a really important paradigmatic shift away from just solely trying to retain the evidence in an artwork and instead trying to understand how conservation can be subjective and that there are other ways that might be more important to ensure the conceptual integrity of an object. And so we have here this push and pull between trying to save the material integrity and the conceptual integrity of an artwork. And so you can really clearly see this in working with Indigenous peoples, where conservators started wanting to make sure that Indigenous nations had access to their heritage in ways that were needed. And conservators also began to work with contemporary artists to ensure that the artwork they created retained the right conceptual meaning over its lifetime as it changed. And so today we have a place where conservation ethics insists that conservators still consider the materiality of their objects they are preserving, but we also have to balance these material needs with the object's contextual requirements, foremost an object's multifaceted meanings, but also the needs of the stakeholders who created, cared for, and for whom these objects are important. And we really see this explicitly in this wonderful photo here. I was granted permission to publish this from Te Papa, and we see one of their cloaks being worn at a ceremony. And the cloak is in the collection of the museum, but it is often brought out and worn when the Maori deem it appropriate for their ceremonies. So to end, the ultimate goal of my article was to give curators and scholars the theoretical tools needed to consider the issue of wearing historic garments more fully, but also in alignment with contemporary shifts in conservation ethics. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And Kenna, we invite you.
Hi, thank you, Petra. Thank you, everyone else, for allowing all of us this platform. You can go to the first slide. I wrote All the Bazooms Go, which uses a quote from the legendary Diana Vreeland in the title here. I hope that was eye-catching. I intended it that way, but it really says something, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I made 5 main points in this article. For context, just more broadly, I did this research as part of my master's thesis starting really 2019, but 2020, 2021, so early in the pandemic. And that thesis was on size bias and body diversity in museums with collections of fashion and dress. So I interviewed museum staff across the US to get an idea of essentially the state of thought in the field. And I ended up using the Met as a case study because it's such an influential museum internationally. It has a huge fashion collection, and amazingly enough, many of its exhibition records are preserved for public research. And that being said, because this topic is not really frequently discussed in the field, I had to foreground everything by stating that 1, fat people existed in history and were fashionable, and I use the word fat neutrally. It's a descriptor of body size, non-judgmental. And 2, museums do have larger clothing in their collections. So I really had to get past those 2 points before I could engage more fully with this topic. And on this slide here on the right, this is a circa 1900 House of Worth gown. And this is a great example of that. It's from the Met itself. And you can see that it is visibly not even in the realm of fitting on the Kyoto mannequin that it's been mounted on. Several of these gowns were donated at the same time. This one and several others of the lot have never been exhibited, and none of them have been exhibited since the early 90s, according to the online records. The Met is useful as a case study, specifically because blockbuster exhibitions like Savage Beauty came out of the work that Diana Vreeland did in the 70s and 80s as a special consultant. She had been the editor of Vogue, and the CI Costume Institute obviously still has a very strong relationship with Vogue, with the fashion industry, as do many fashion museums around the world, which, many of them are made in the CI's image. And so it makes sense that fashionable standards of size would influence museum collections and their exhibitions. In the CI, mannequins were literally reshaped according to Vreeland's vision of the ideal body, which is where this "all the bazooms go" quote comes from. She shaved off the bosoms of the mannequins and, wanted to lengthen the proportions of their torsos. So curators collect sample sizes. They're not only nice to look at, but also they'll fit pre-existing mannequins across collections. Modern runways are not particularly diverse, even if couture originally came out of custom dressmaking. And the CI does designer retrospectives using those sample sizes because they showcase the designer's original intention. I don't know if I should be air quoting that or not. Designers don't usually work initially or often ever with plus sizes, and the CI very much focuses on fashion as an art form. They value masterworks of design over clothing as material culture, as social history. And as an object example here on the right, Nan Kempner's clothing exhibited at Nan Kempner American Chic in 2006. This was written up in a press release by the Met as an ideal acquisition for the museum precisely because she wore sample sizes. So in this paradigm, the museum is very much a continuation of the runway. It is not separate from the fashion industry. And the other part of this kind of ideal body problem is that donors often donate or bequeath their own clothing, and they want to be remembered in their best. It's kind of human nature. Historically, people generally save clothing that has sentimental value. It's things like prom and wedding dresses, and these also happen to be dresses that are worn at times in which people are their smallest adult size by intention or by nature. And so when people visit the museum then, they're used to seeing these very tiny, historic, vintage, even contemporary garments. So what incentive would they have to donate larger items? In fashion schools, designers are trained to design for model bodies. If they look to museums for inspiration, which many of them do, and they claim to do so as well publicly, they only see more small sizes. So again, what incentive do they have to design larger, let alone to donate those items, those examples, and think that they would be appreciated? Even fashion museums without commercial connections to the fashion industry are therefore connected to the fashion industry that way, because history informs the present. We are engaged in this reciprocating cycle. So speaking of the present, the last chunk of my article covers mannequins and recent exhibition diversity. Again, the article is a case study of the Met. There were many outside exhibits that I can't include here, but many of these other museums can't afford new mannequins all the time. But the Met is actually one that periodically orders new matching sets of mannequins. And this is at least partially for consistency, because if the mannequins all look the same, they won't distract from the clothing. But this also means, kind of obviously, that there's no body diversity amongst the mannequins. And CI curators diverged from this somewhat in 2023's Women Dressing Women exhibition, which was intrinsically about recovering design work that was lost to the canon. They included a figure based on a wheelchair user who has cerebral palsy, another that was short-statured based on a person with achondroplasia, and one larger mannequin, which is the one that you see in this image on the left. Now, when I visited this exhibit, this presentation struck me as pretty low-hanging fruit, honestly, because first of all, this dress is new, so they could just go out and buy it fresh. They didn't have to hunt for an older plus-size dress that had history to it. And second of all, it's a stretch material. This can fit a mannequin both larger and smaller than this size. And in fact, the dress is designed to be multi-size. The brand generally makes clothing that is like SML, like it's meant to fit multiple sizes at once. Thinking about this, if they wanted a multi-size woman-designed item, a Fortuny dress on a larger mannequin could easily have filled this spot. If we talk about an inclusive style, one that's already in the exhibition, if we look at this image on the right, they could have just mounted it on a larger mannequin. They mounted it on a standard small one. And then looking at the label here, you can screenshot, read it later, the object is essentially filling two duties of interpretation: plus-size inclusion on the left hand and ethical practices on the right. Its focus is not purely on larger bodies or plus-size fashion. So I don't exactly sense a long history of dressing and appreciating larger bodies when I look at this on display. However, what it does demonstrate is that contemporary plus-size design can have a place in the museum without that display having to be purely about its plus-size existence. And that's important in its own right. That is pushing against tokenization. When I visited this, I spoke to several other visitors and just total strangers, just cold called them, and there were no negative comments about the mannequin's presence in the museum. Some people said they didn't notice it. Other people were really, really positive about it being there, but nobody felt jarred by its presence, which is something I'd heard floated around in my earlier interviews. So, and judging, of course, by the published reviews of the show, people only wanted more body diversity. So this is absolutely a move that I appreciate, but I would also like to see some of the CI's larger historical garments on display, and also for curators to begin diversifying the sizes they currently collect, because that's step one of improving the future. We can't really change the past, but there's still a great deal we can do in this area, especially given the unique position of the CI of being able to acquire and make new custom mannequins. So that's my article in short, and essentially I hope it gives some food for thought about questioning traditional collecting and methods of display in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to invite our guests to join us. So just very quickly, because I think each one of your talks very nicely illustrates what was called for. But that's really just at its core, turning our work a little bit on its head, thinking about how we as museum practitioners, as scholars, curators, conservators, as museum visitors, can be more open, I think, to new approaches in our work. And I think, Sarah, your points around how the philosophy around dress in the museum context evolved and changed, and then we became sort of affixed to one version of it, and we haven't quite figured out how to let that go yet. And kind of to your point about, is the inclusion of a plus size mannequin done for that reason? Or is it something that should just be naturally included in all of our presentations because it is a way of our world, the way that we exist as human beings? And Dyese, thinking about community collaboration and curation to me really also intersects with many of these ideas from the standpoint of social history, but also the term that Sarah put forward too around community memory. And I feel like that's kind of, in a way, what was at the heart of this special issue. So I'm going to start with some specific questions. I think they're going to keep coming in. But Dot has a question for Sarah, which is, does the recommendation to not wear historic garments extend to displaying them on mannequins?
So the 1980s, early 1990s guidelines was really specifically about putting historic clothing on living people with bodies and moving. It doesn't really extend to mannequins. There are some general conservation guidelines. We don't advise exposing historic costume even on mannequins to high light levels for a very long time and a lot of dust. And then there is always the adage, you want to fit the mannequin to the costume or the garment and not the garment to the mannequin. And so Kenna, I love your paper talking about kind of the larger mannequins. It's very interesting. But yeah, thank you.
Then we have a question for Kenna around whether or not your thesis is available for reading in full anywhere. And I think the term was fascinating.
Thank you. Yes, it is. It's open access, freely available on ProQuest. I believe if you Google my name and then Fat by the Wayside, which is the opener line to it, you should be able to access it.
Thank you. And Dyese, we have a question for you as well. How are you using the takeaways from your project with your colleagues in your current and future work? And do you have additional plans related to community curation in specific areas?
Thank you. That's a great question. Thanks, Jenny Lee, for that question. There were many takeaways. I think one of the main ones was, again, this idea of like transforming the museum, the fashion museum into this space where these conversations take place. But I think what's important to consider is like transforming it from what, right? So we have to think about the context and the history of fashion museums or museums in general and how they've been exclusive in a lot of ways. They've been places where these types of conversations aren't happening, right? Obviously, there's been a lot of work to move away from that and just be more inclusive in terms of, even the conversations we're having now about like size inclusivity and things and such. So I think that was one of the main takeaways that I do hope to continue to implement throughout my work. I feel strongly about working with community in my research and making sure that I'm not just extracting information, putting it up on display, and then walking away, right? So I try to make sure to engage my communities that I'm working with, bringing them to the exhibition to see it, asking them would they like to do talks, or just being really intentional in terms of showing care in their stories and their contribution and labor to the work.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to spend a moment here because just thinking about people-based textile conservation, thinking about community-focused curation, and taking the time to research and extract works of art that represent a range of body types. This all takes time, right? And so this is in no way, absolutely, should it ever be used as an excuse. But I think knowing that we live in a professional society and an industry that is professionalized, and we have so many external factors weighing in, how would each of you advise scholars to, again, kind of shake up that thinking and to further continue that dedication to that more slow and steady work? Because I think that it can be, sometimes it's the path of least resistance, right? And that is a crutch that we as a discipline, I think, have fallen into a practice.
Yeah, I think you said it greatly, right? Like it's a slow and steady. Um, Museums have a long history, like a very, very long history. And I think as times shift, as society shifts, we have to be open to change, right? And whatever that means. I think it's about mindset, and I think consistency as well, and also dedication. And hopefully, you know, people who want to see change and cater to our growing society are in position to make those changes, in positions of power, and can really spearhead the type of work that we're all trying to do.
Thank you. Sarah, would you like to add anything?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's doing what you can. I think if you have the intention and there is an opportunity, even if it's a small opportunity, take it, try it, see what you think, try to do your best at it, learn from it, and be invigorated by it. And then pretty soon, I think it'll start becoming more normal, and it'll become like a normalized process of your praxis, and then you'll end up slowly but surely having incorporated it, and then having mentored emerging professionals, and then it just becomes more ingrained into the museum field.
Thank you. So before we go back to Kenna, please.
Sorry, I do have something to say. This is actually really interesting for my topic, at least. I believe I mentioned it in the article itself, but not in my discussion here, that we actually do see more body diversity in a certain segment of museums, and that is historical societies and really smaller museums who are not so much focused on fashion as art, but dress as material culture and personal history. And so, in my opinion, I very much feel that progress in this sector is very much a question of perspective. And as I said, many museums already have larger garments in their collection. So it's not a matter of having to go out and acquire something that doesn't exist or that you can't find. It's a matter of, reevaluating the present collections, and just instead of passing something over because you don't think it will fit the standard mannequins, or maybe previous curators didn't care as much about it, mounting that item and taking its history seriously and putting it on display.
Well, you read my mind, because my next question was going to be around social history and, again, that evolution within our field, because as we're thinking about reframing fashion in the museum, to me, it was an interesting topic to tackle because, many of us know, of course, that, when CSA was founded 50 years ago, part of the reason that CSA was founded was in an effort to legitimize our work, to offer a foundation, to, find space, make space in an academic environment where, paintings and sculpture were king, and, fashion was fighting its way, fashion, textiles, material culture was fighting its way to that table. And so it's been interesting now to see that shift, that sort of, again, slow but steady shift, where the acceptance of fashion as art has now, I think, been fully embraced. But now it's like we're taking, steps in a different direction to readdress and re-welcome, fashion as an example of social history, with, I think, more gusto. And, as you just mentioned, Ken, I was thinking about all of these wonderful smaller collections across the country that, because of lack of resources, don't have the same kind of visibility that larger institutions do. And so then again, that speaks to like those same narratives being repeated over and over again. And I think that, comes to light in the research that Sarah's putting forward, the research that Dyese is putting forward, and also, as you just beautifully summarized for us here, in regard to sizing and availability. Okay, so there are more questions here, so I'm going to go through these so we don't miss anyone. Okay, we have a question for Kenna. Has anyone approached the mannequin makers to produce additional real body types? This is a lovely question. Your photo shows a large woman looking at a mannequin, and I wondered what she thought.
So I don't remember if she was one of the people I talked to at that day that I took the photo. But yes, I mean, as I think if you look at the article, you'll see a photograph from the manufacturer Grenacher. They have a variety of mannequins. They are shop mannequins. They're not necessarily meant for museum use. I've been corresponding with another scholar who works kind of tangentially on this topic, Von Skrijen, from the Netherlands, who has done interviews with Bonaveri, and Bonaveri has plus size mannequins. For those who don't know, Bonaveri are common mannequins to see in the museum environment, as well as, you know, things like the Kyoto, which are famously small. So my research was more focused on interviewing museum staff and looking at records and kind of the history of the development of this. But so I haven't talked to the manufacturers themselves, but I can only guess that, you know, overtures have been made, and what I did hear from my interviewees was that it was generally a question of money. So that's as I said, that's where the CI is, you know, specially posed, specially placed to really have a potential large impact here. And many other small museums, you know, can't just do the same thing because they don't have the budget, they don't have the influence.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah, there are a couple of questions that are specific to Marilyn Monroe's dress, and of course Kim Kardashian's now infamous wearing of it, speaking of social history. And one question speaks to, you know, the concerns, I think, of deodorant, perfume, you know, the way in which we present ourselves today in this society, and what effects that might have on historical garments. And then also specifically to Kim Kardashian's decision to wear this garment, and whether or not, you know, that was, in your opinion, really more about, you know, was it controversial itself, and at the time that she wore it because it aligned significantly with her more provocative way of dressing, and you know, that is sort of a two-part question, if you will.
Sure, yeah. So it was a fun event. I've been thinking a lot about it, and I actually gave like an hour-long lecture for ICON, the Institute for Conservation, about my this whole instance and my thoughts. And so is makeup, oils, perspiration, is that a concern when you wear a historic costume? Absolutely. And so when conservators, you know, are working with stakeholders to ensure that the costume is worn, we're trying to do it in a way that does ensure there isn't massive material loss, although again, we're judging that in relation to what we're trying to achieve and help facilitate conceptually, and with the actual integrity of the artwork and the relationship the stakeholders has with, you know, that object. And so damage, you know, there has to be an acceptance that if historic costume is worn, damage will likely occur. And the question is that level of damage that you're anticipating to occur, is it worth it? You know, is the risk worth it? And there's no solid answer about it. But I have also written on this topic for conservators, trying to give them a risk assessment guideline to go through. And I'd be happy to share that at some point. And then to your second question about Kim Kardashian, I'd actually kind of rather pivot and just say, people were really upset that the materiality of the dress was altered, that it got damaged for whatever reason she wore it. And I'm not going to say I know why she wanted to wear it. What I find most problematic is that the conceptual integrity of the dress was damaged, because conceptually the dress was meant to be on a naked body. It was meant to look naked. It was meant to match the skin tone of Marilyn Monroe. And yet when it was worn on Kim Kardashian, it did not look that way. It did not look nude. She did not look nude, you know? And so conceptually, the dress did not live up to what the maker, Bob Mackie, and the original wearer wanted. And so it's in that aspect that I find the incident most troubling, not even that she wore it. And I'll stop there.
No, that's fantastic. I'm glad that you added that. Thank you. Oh, there's so many places we could go, but I'm going to stay on topic. So Dyese, this question is for you, but I am going to begin with you and then extend it to our other guests. Zora says, I'm an aspiring curator. How would you describe your transitions from a student in your field of study to an assistant professor and curator?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, because I'm very fresh on the other side. Just graduated in August, but I've just been really blessed in that I was in institutions where historical collections exist, like Iowa State and Cornell, and I had many opportunities to engage with those collections and do exhibitions and kind of learn the ropes in a safe space, right? Like you're at a university, you have support there. So I was really lucky in that I got a chance to kind of play and figure out, what my style is and topics I may want to engage with and what it takes to put on an exhibition. And those experiences have set me up in my position now, and as I continue throughout my career to really just hone in on those skills and find new ways to keep improving. So hopefully, Zora, you're in a space where you can engage right in these practices. If not through your university, maybe like Kenna mentioned, a local historical society where you can just engage with the material and or garments and start from there. Also, digital exhibition is a great tool too, right? Like we have technology now, so even if you don't have access to physical garments, maybe you could, put something together that's more of a digital format, and that's a great way to engage in curation as well.
Thank you, Dyese. Kenna, how about you? How's your transition been from student to, I mean, we're always students forever, but yes.
So I have technically been in college almost since 2012 without fail, which is kind of crazy to think about. But essentially, I love academia. I love learning. I also love teaching. It wasn't in my bio, but I am now a professor in my own right, and really enjoying it. And this is very much for me. It's been a process of just being so passionate about my topic and about both museum work and research and writing that it just kind of came naturally together. But I say that knowing I depended on an immense amount of connections and the help of others to get me where I am today. So it's very much, not only a question of passion, but knowing what resources are at your disposal and also who you can rely on in your field, in your kind of personal network to kind of grab those and shove them your way.
Thank you. Sarah, how about you?
Oh, goodness. So I'm defending my dissertation the week after next. And so
Congratulations.
I'm now, I don't know, I've been a PhD student for 10 years, and I've done it always part-time with my museum job, first at the Costume Institute and now at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And all I have to say is I'm always still learning. I'm now learning much more from the younger, emerging generation than and I'm now realizing I'm an older, like more established, but I still consider myself an emerging professional. And I still think that there's so much more for me to learn and so much to do. And now that I won't be a student, I'm kind of actually going to be at a loss because now I'm like, maybe I should go get an MBA because I really think administration, you might not, if you're working in a museum, think that administration is really important, but it is so important. And I know, Petra, I'm going to look at you as an administrator in a museum, in a large museum, that, as much as we love our fashion history, it's really, you should also be always trying to engage with how to effectively do nonprofit management if you are interested in the museum field or academia. And I'll stop.
Great. So Dyese, I have one more question for you, and then I have a question for the group before we conclude. And this is from Kay Killen Wilson. And they say, I may have missed it, but what motivated your collaborative exhibitions? I don't know if you want to spend just a little bit more time on that.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, the exhibition was a part of the Cornell University Biennial. And as a part of that program, which is like a university-wide art program, they decided to start an initiative where they invited students to do an exhibition. It was actually two student groups. We were one of two student groups selected. So three of us were in the apparel design department, and one of us was in anthropology, and we knew each other, and the opportunity came about, and we went for it. So it was right place, right time, and of course, support from the Cornell Biennial in terms of really engaging students, which was the first year that they did it.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So in closing, you know, I had the privilege to work on this, as I said, for, almost a year. I think it was actually a year, and it was one of those things where I imagine as you're like balancing work and PhD programs, etc. Like you're waking up very early, doing like committing your time before you go to work, and you know, and so it was really interesting to me to hear you offer your research because I spent so much time reading about it to then have that touch of sort of real human engagement added as a layer. So this has been a really rewarding conversation for me selfishly, and so I very much am grateful to you. But as individuals working on this issue, when you actually got it, because there are 8 articles in total, plus several reviews in the back. So it's not an insignificant issue. It's kind of hefty. It sort of surprised me when I got it. But sort of reading through the research, what were your reflections and what did you learn either from reading your own work in context with others or from one another? Yes, Kenna.
So I just want to say, when reading through that issue, I was so happy to realize that I wasn't alone. And I mean, intellectually, I knew that. I've been aware of, especially Sarah and Dyese's research and work. I've been aware of these things kind of culminating, but it was really nice to have the issue as proof of that. And I mean, especially I think the article that came right before mine by Anne Bissonnette. I mean, it's like these things are touching exactly the same concepts that I am working on in my research. And so it was really fulfilling to see that.
I echo the exact same sentiments. I mean, speaking about community, it just was refreshing to see that there are scholars and beyond scholars, right? Like colleagues and just folks at CSA specifically who are engaging in these conversations. So it was just really refreshing and exciting too to see that as a field of study, we're really excited and willing to have these conversations.
Yeah, Dyese, I'll echo your word, exciting. I think, I've been in this field about 20 years now, and to see myself like kind of, in the table of contents along so many people I admire and are kind of like rock stars, like to mention Anne Bissonnette. I mean, she's done incredible work for the field, was really just incredible. And to see and kind of understand even through my own personal trajectory, which is a lot of like what my article was about. It is kind of about my own kind of experience and growing in this field, how things have changed. And also, Petra, getting to work with you, I've watched you and your career grow, from new fields and everything. And it's just been really exciting. So
Thank you.
Thanks so much for putting this together.
Oh, well, I definitely didn't do it alone, but I am grateful for the opportunity. Thank you. CSA has a great series. This is just one in a number of talks that CSA is lining up. If you are not a member, please become a member. We are fun. We like to learn. And there's a lot more to what we do. So thank you all for being with us this evening. Kenna, Sarah, Dyese, thank you for spending time with us. And we welcome you all to next time.